One argument for abortion that I think needs to be properly addressed concerns the idea of drawing a defining line determining personhood at the age at which an unborn baby, a fetus, becomes viable. Before an age of so many months, a fetus is not viable, which means that it cannot be removed from its mother's womb and survive. To that extent, the life of the fetus is absolutely dependent on the life of the mother. Due to this absolute dependence, many pro-choicers conclude that the fetus is not yet really a person like you and I are, because it is incapable of being an independent individual like you and I are. The age of viability is seen as a line between non-personhood and personhood. Once the fetus crosses the line, many pro-choicers say that it ought to then be considered a person deserving of rights, such as the right to life. But if it has not yet crossed the line, then it ought not to be considered a person and therefore be morally allowed to abort. On its face, this argument seems to have merit, but under examination, I do not think it holds up. You see, the tricky thing about viability is that the age of viability keeps changing. The line keeps moving closer to conception. Fetuses used to pretty much only be able to survive outside the womb post 24 to 28 weeks into a pregnancy. Now more and more, they are able to survive at 22 or even 21 weeks. This poses a series of very problematic questions to the pro-choice minded individual. Does the advancement of medical science determine whether or not a fetus is a person? Can you honestly say that a fetus is a person at 21 weeks, but not a person at 20 weeks, when in the future, fetuses will in all likelihood be viable at 20 weeks, or even earlier, so long as medical science is allowed to progress? Another consideration to take into account is what I like to call the Brave New World scenario. In Aldous Huxley's novel, he imagines that at some point in the future, fetuses will be viable and able to live independently of a mother's womb at any time, due to the perfection of artificial incubation. Now, it's true that Brave New World is a science fiction novel, and test tubes capable of growing humans do not yet exist, but still, many in the scientific community do believe that one day this will be possible. Additionally, since the argument from viability is so flimsy, many politicians have bypassed it. In states like New York and others, the restrictions around late-term abortions have loosened significantly in recent years. To them, as well as me, the line dividing non-viability and viability is useless, because it not only keeps changing, but might one day cease to exist altogether in the Brave New World. At this time, there's probably some people out there that are fairly annoyed and likely thinking to themselves, okay, viability may not be the best marker for determining whether or not a fetus is a person, but do you really expect me to believe that a fetus is a person from the moment it's conceived? Well, as it happens, the pro-life versus pro-choice personhood debate was already covered extensively in the previous 2 videos in this series on abortion. The first video, Is Abortion Reasonable?, primarily focuses on 2 compelling pro-choice arguments that conclude, among other things, that fetuses are not persons and are therefore morally allowed to abort, while the second video, Is Abortion Immoral?, focuses on some compelling pro-life arguments, one of which is able to show that abortion is immoral without even needing to prove that fetuses are persons. The purpose of this talk is ultimately to be an addendum to what we've discussed previously, so I would reply in part to the personhood question by simply directing you to those videos, the links to which are in the description below. The remainder of this video will focus on the few things concerning the issues of personhood and abortion that I was not able to fit into our previous discussions. To those who question whether the line at conception is a better line than the line at viability upon which to define personhood, I say your skepticism is not without merit. As I said in the last video, if there's one thing I've learned from reading about abortion, it's that defining precisely what a person is and when personhood begins is actually a very tricky business, even though it's obvious and natural to say that I, for instance, am a person. Indeed, a coherent theory about when personhood begins, or what that even means, has never and probably will never be agreed upon. Still, though, persons do exist, and we nevertheless find the term to be extremely useful in many moral debates, including those centered around abortion. So what I would say to those who look at a fertilized human egg cell, a zygote, and find it absurd to call such a thing a person, is to consider that conception is in fact the point at which moral arguments regarding abortion began. Why is this so? Well, the reason moral questions can be raised here is due to the fact that there is a new genetically unique human organism to have questions about, whereas before conception, there was none. A solid, non-arbitrary line has been drawn between no discussion and a discussion. And so while it is difficult to say that conception is the line at which an unborn human is a person, it is still a better line by which to make a moral judgment than viability, and that it's a line that does not and cannot move. To put it another way, while ascribing personhood at conception is questionable, abortion is even more questionable, because isn't it unwise to tamper with a human life that we can't agree on the classification of, but will most certainly agree on the classification of later, at some other time, that none of us can definitively point to? I mean, for goodness sake, even after a baby is born, its personhood is disputed. It's like, if the moral waters get murkier and murkier the further we wade into them, the pro-life view is that maybe we should stay in the shallows. Again, I do not think that the morality of abortion stands or falls on whether or not the unborn are persons. Don Marquise's paper, Why Abortion is Immoral, discussed in the last video, demonstrates this in a very impressive fashion. However, while I'm fond of his argument, I do think that there are some very interesting pro-life personhood arguments beyond the quasi-one I just made that are worth taking the time to touch on. The philosopher Philip Devine wrote a very interesting paper called The Scope of the Prohibition Against Killing, in which he makes several insightful observations. It must be said that Devine's paper is not a straightforward personhood argument, and that he actually presents multiple pro-life arguments, some having to do with personhood and some not. We briefly covered some of his points in the last video, but the one I'd like to focus on in this video concerns not our attitudes towards the unborn, but the recently deceased. In the following quotation, Devine highlights the fact that there actually is something morally significant about being a member of the human species, even if you're definitely not a person. The principle of respect for persons also extends by what might be called the overflow principle to things closely associated with persons. Thus, corpses ought not to be treated as ordinary garbage, and one might also argue that a modicum of reverence should be accorded the processes by which persons come to be. Here, Devine is not taking a stance on when a human life is or is not a person, although in other parts of his paper he makes a case that we should treat embryos and fetuses as persons, at least insofar as they have the right to life. But what he is pointing out is that the vast majority of people, both pro-life and pro-choice, do feel that it would be immoral to treat the recently dead like ordinary garbage. We go to great lengths to buy expensive tombstones and bury our friends and relatives at ceremonial gatherings called funerals because we feel that we have certain moral obligations toward them, even though as corpses, our friends and relatives are definitely not persons. This is a profound point because it highlights the inconsistency of the cavalier attitude toward abortion that many popular pro-choicers have. Why have moral obligations toward the dead, but no moral obligations toward the newly conceived and living? Devine's recognition here that there actually is intrinsic moral worth in simply being a member of the human species, even if your personhood status is unclear, or in the case of a corpse, certainly non-existent, sheds light on some of the abortion exceptions I talked about in the last video. For instance, I talked about a condition known as anencephaly. To recap what I said on it, here is what I said on it. Anencephaly is a condition in which a baby does not develop large portions of its skull and brain. Often no more than a brain stem can be found, if even that. The condition can be diagnosed during pregnancy by means of ultrasounds and prenatal testing, or after birth due to the baby's severely deformed head. All anencephalic babies die during pregnancy or not very long after birth. It is a fatal condition. Aborting these babies before birth or euthanizing them by passive or active means after birth, so long as the condition is 100% confirmed, should be allowed in my view, because the question is not if the child is going to die soon, but exactly when. To put it in terms that Don Marquise might use, they simply do not have the possibility of having any kind of future, let alone one like ours, and so killing them would not be wrong. So I concluded, with much discomfort, that abortion and euthanasia in such cases ought to be allowed. My discomfort was a bit of a puzzle to me for a while, but Divine's observation, I think, best explains it. Anencephalic babies have no possibility of having any kind of future. They are, in a sense, living corpses. Think of adult brain-dead individuals as well. We may concede that pulling the plug on them is appropriate, just as we may concede that aborting or euthanizing anencephalic babies is appropriate. But still, we would be most reluctant to permit the use of such individuals for experiments, or their being killed for food. Why? Because they're humans, and just being human accords an individual a certain degree of special reverence, even if that individual is basically dead or actually dead. If we do have this reverence in these cases, shouldn't we have even more reverence for those human lives that are perfectly healthy, but that just haven't been fully developed yet? It must be said here that Divine also recognizes that members of other similarly intelligent species, such as a race of space-traveling Martians, would also have intrinsic value due to their belonging to a species much like our own. He at one point in his paper argues that all members belonging to intelligent species should generally be protected against being killed no matter their stage of development, but also that humans would have a special obligation not to kill their fellow humans in such a reality due to the kinship we would all share as being a part of the human species, or family, if you will. Us dealing with the rights of Martians is all hypothetical, of course, but I do think it's important to point out that Divine's pro-life paper is not short-sighted in this respect. Divine's observation about corpses and my analysis of it, again, I just think underscores the inconsistency of attitudes many influential pro-choicers hold and demonstrates that the personhood question is far weirder than it is often made out to be. Moving on from the personhood debate, but keeping consistency and corpses in mind, I'd like to close by presenting a Kantian argument against abortion by Harry J. Gensler, alternatively titled The Golden Rule Argument Against Abortion. Before we jump into the passages that make up what I believe to be the strongest thrust of Gensler's argument, I do want to point out that he for some reason chooses to spell the word all right as two words, all and right. I have no clue why he does this, but I don't think it's a typo because that is how it's spelled throughout his paper. So just keep that in mind as we read this passage that lays the groundwork for the rest of his argument. It's a bit wordy and uses what I like to call logic speak, but I think it's best for you to hear Gensler's actual words instead of my words put into his mouth, even if he can be a bit convoluted and annoying. My Kantian approach to abortion stresses consistency. Here I will use two consistency requirements, based on the universalizability and prescriptivity principles, and a third consistency requirement derived from these two, a version of the Golden Rule. The following argument displays these three requirements and how the third follows from the first two. If you are consistent and think that it would be all right for someone to do A to X, then you will think that it would be all right for someone to do A to you in similar circumstances. If you are consistent and think that it would be all right for someone to do A to you in similar circumstances, then you will consent to the idea of someone doing A to you in similar circumstances. Therefore, if you are consistent and think that it would be all right to do A to X, then you will consent to the idea of someone doing A to you in similar circumstances. GR Golden Rule. The first premise can be justified by the universalizability principle, which demands that we make similar ethical judgments about the same sort of situation, regardless of the individuals involved. So if I think it would be all right to rob Jones, but I don't think it would be all right for someone to rob me, and in an imagined exactly similar situation, then I violate universalizability and am inconsistent. The second premise can be justified by the prescriptivity principle, which demands that we keep our ethical beliefs in harmony with the rest of our lives, our actions, intentions, desires, and so forth. So if I think an act would be all right, but I don't consent to it being done, then I violate prescriptivity and am inconsistent. These and further derived requirements can be formulated and justified in a rigorous way, but I won't do that here. The conclusion GR is a form of the Golden Rule. If I think it would be all right to rob Jones, but yet I don't consent to or approve of the idea of someone robbing me in similar circumstances, then I violate the golden rule and am inconsistent. We are all familiar with the golden rule, which is most commonly understood as the principle of treating others as one would want to be treated by them. So some of you are probably thinking that everything I just read there is a long, pseudo-intellectual preamble to Gensler putting forth the basic pro-life view, that pro-choicers are inconsistent, because after all, most of them are glad to have not been aborted. He is, of course, arguing that pro-choicers are inconsistent, but not in the basic run-of-the-mill way that you might expect. As we shall see in this next passage that brings us back to the dead, Gensler anticipates that it might seem easy to argue this way on abortion. How would you like it if someone had aborted you? Should we say that you don't like the idea, and so you can't consistently hold that abortion is permissible? Or should we say that as an ignorant fetus, you would not have known enough to have been against the abortion, so that this argument won't work? Let us slow down and try to understand the golden rule more clearly before applying it to abortion. Properly understood, the golden rule has to do with my present reaction toward a hypothetical case, not with how I would react if I were in the hypothetical case. A few examples may clarify things. Consider this chart. Issue: do I think it permissible to violate X's will after his death? Right question: do I now consent to the idea of my will being violated after my death? Wrong question: if my will is violated after my death, would I then, while dead, consent to this action? The point of this chart is that, by the golden rule, to be consistent in answering yes to the issue, I must also answer yes to the right question. But I need not answer yes to the wrong question. Presumably, I would answer no to the right question. When I consider the hypothetical case of my will being violated after my death, I find that I now, while alive, do not consent to or approve of this action. But the wrong question has to do with what I, if my will was violated after my death, would consent to or approve of while thus dead and thus ignorant of the violation. Golden rule, correctly understood, has nothing to do with the wrong question. Here we are faced not only with the idea that corpses ought not to be treated like ordinary garbage, but also that they have rights that should be honored, such as the right to not have their will violated even though they are in the ground. When put the way I just put it, this idea seems beyond strange, but in reality it is entirely commonplace. I've never met someone who's gone through the trouble of drawing up a will who doesn't care about if it's followed or not. The genius of Gensler's reasoning here is that he correctly identifies the fact that if you or I think it would be wrong for someone to violate our wills after we're buried, the only way we can justify this belief is by asking the question of how we feel about the violation now, not how we would feel about the violation while rotting 6 feet under the ground. Quoting Gensler, again, the golden rule has to do with my present reaction toward a hypothetical case in which I may imagine myself as dead or even a fetus, but not with how I would react while dead or a fetus in the hypothetical situation. But is it legitimate to apply the golden rule to our treatment of a fetus? Consider a case not involving abortion. Issue: do I think it permissible to blind X while X is a fetus? Right question: do I now consent to the idea of my having been blinded while a fetus? Wrong question: if I were blinded while a fetus, would I then, while a fetus, consent to this action? Suppose that you had a sadistic mother who, while pregnant with you, contemplated injecting herself with a blindness drug, which would have no effect on her, but which would cause the fetus, you, to be born blind and remain blind all your life. Your mother could have done this to you. Do you think this would have been all right? And do you consent to the idea of her having done this? The answer is a clear no. And an equally clear no, regardless of the time of pregnancy that we imagine the injection taking place. We could then argue this way. If you are consistent and think that blinding a fetus is normally permissible, then you will consent to the idea of your having been blinded while a fetus in normal circumstances from the Golden Rule. You do not consent to the idea of your having been blinded while a fetus in normal circumstances. Therefore, if you are consistent, then you will not think that blinding a fetus is normally permissible. Again, with most people, the second premise will be true. Most people can be presumed not to consent to or approve of the idea of this act having been done to them. Is it legitimate to apply the Golden Rule to our treatment of a fetus? Surely it is. The above reasoning makes good sense. If a pregnant woman is about to do something harmful to the fetus, like taking drugs or excessive alcohol or cigarettes, it seems appropriate for her to ask, how do I now react to the idea of my mother having done this same thing while she was pregnant with me? Applying the Golden Rule to a fetus raises no special problems. And since it raises no special problems, the Golden Rule is indeed, as it turns out, a special problem for the pro-choice-minded individual. Reading Gensler. The application of the Golden Rule to abortion is similar. We need only switch from a blindness drug, which blinds the fetus, to a death drug, which kills the fetus. Your mother could have killed you through such a death drug or other means of abortion. Do you think this would have been all right? And do you consent to or approve of the idea of her having done this? Again, the answer is a clear no, and an equally clear no regardless of the time of pregnancy that we imagine the killing taking place. We can argue as we did concerning blinding. If you are consistent and think that abortion is normally permissible, then you will consent to the idea of your having been aborted in normal circumstances. From GR. You do not consent to the idea of your having been aborted in normal circumstances. Therefore, if you are consistent, then you will not think that abortion is normally permissible. Again, with most people, the second premise will be true. Most people can be presumed not to consent to or approve of the idea of this act having been done to them. So insofar as most people take a consistent position, they will not think that abortion is normally permissible. Moving on from the main thrust of Gensler's reasoning, I would like to cover a portion of the last section of his paper that deals with objections to his argument. I'm only going to go over one of them because I think it is broadly relevant to the pro-choice masses, but if you would like to read Gensler's paper in full, including his responses to all objections, please click on the link to his paper in the description below. One objection to Gensler's argument that he anticipates is as follows. Let us consider a person who approves of abortion, but not infanticide or the blindness drug. Why couldn't such a person consent to the idea of himself having been aborted under imagined or actual normal circumstances, and hence be consistent? Here is Gensler's response. Such a person could be consistent, but only with bizarre desires about how he himself is to be treated. Let us suppose that someone combined these three judgments, as many are being brought up to do in our society today. A. It is wrong to blind an adult or child or infant or fetus. B. It is wrong to kill an adult or child or infant. C. It is permissible to kill a fetus. To be consistent, the person would have to answer these questions as follows. Do you consent to the idea of my blinding you now? No. Do you consent to the idea of my having blinded you yesterday? No. When you were 5 years old? No. When you were 1 day old? No. Before you were born? No. Do you consent to the idea of my killing you now? No. Do you consent to the idea of my having killed you yesterday? No. When you were 5 years old? No. When you were 1 day old? No. Before you were born? Yes. It is strange that the person disapproves equally of being blinded at the various times and disapproves equally of being killed at the first 4 times, and yet approves of being killed at the last time. He opposes the blindings because, regardless of their timing, the effect would be the same. He would be blind. He opposes the killings at the first 4 times because, again, the effect would be the same. He would not be alive. But killing at the 5th time has the same effect. Why should he not oppose this killing also? The yes here seems rather strange. Of course, one who thinks his life not worth living could give a yes to the idea of his having been killed while a fetus, but then we would expect yes answers to the idea of his being killed at the other times as well, which would make him inconsistent if he held that it is wrong to kill an adult or child or infant. So while a person who combines the three judgments above could, in principle, have such desires and be consistent, still this is unlikely to happen very often. To be consistent, the person would have to have very bizarre desires. What I just read, in combination with the rest of the Golden Rule argument, as well as Philip Devine's reasoning and our discussion of the non-viability of the viability argument, I believe backs up Gensler's central claim that most of the time the pro-abortionist will find that he is indeed inconsistent. He is supporting certain moral principles about the treatment of others that he would not wish to have been followed in their actions toward him. But enough about what I believe. What do you believe? Do you think this video strengthens and bolsters the pro-life reasoning I presented in the previous videos in this series? Or do you think it weakens and takes away from the case I made? Please leave your thoughts, comments, and questions in the comments section below. Whether you find the Golden Rule argument against abortion to be compelling or unsatisfactory, I hope you will agree with me in saying that the Golden Rule is something that both pro-lifers and pro-choicers should keep in mind when trying to convert each other to their respective positions. The abortion debate is so polluted with ugliness and hate on both sides that I think the principle of treating others as one would want to be treated by them is the only stage upon which the debate will ever become fruitful. So the next time you find yourself feeling the urge to call your pro-choice friend a rotten baby killer, or your pro-life friend a misogynist who wants nothing more than to control women's bodies, maybe don't. Maybe instead be calm and acknowledge that while you may think your position holds more truth than your friend is still your friend, and therefore deserves to be treated with the same degree of respect and goodwill that you would like to be treated with.